appreciate the opportunity to come back. I think I presented Grand Rounds here back in 2009, and obviously I didn't torture you enough, so I've been brought back again, so I'll try to do my best this time. The title of my talk today is Dried Blood Spots as an Alternate Sample Type for Wellness Testing. I'm going to talk about various aspects of dried blood spot testing, and particularly it's going to be addressed to the wellness testing market, and really looking at whether or not wellness testing using dried blood spots is really something that is appropriate at the current time. So with dried blood spot testing, or DBS, this is what we like to see as far as the sample that we get. Later on we'll see some examples of what we usually get. Dried blood spot cards go by a variety of other names, most common being Guthrie cards or filter paper discs, or even PKU cards. And there's a variety of applications. Obviously the most common, I think everyone is familiar with, is the use of dried blood spots for newborn screening. But more recently, if you look in the literature, there's a variety of studies, especially with new drugs under development and doing preclinical pharmacokinetic assessment, HIV surveillance, wellness testing, and there's a variety of other areas that lend themselves to use of DBS cards. So what I want to cover today is really just sort of take almost an overview of blood spot testing, talk a little bit about the history, some of the special considerations with respect to dried blood spot testing, spend a little bit of time looking at the effect of blood properties on DBS testing. As a matrix or as a sample type, DBS cards are very different than the tube of blood that I think many people are familiar in receiving in the clinical lab. Also, I'll talk about some new applications and then what I think are maybe some future directions that dried blood spot testing might take. So, from a historical perspective, I guess, if you go back to the original work of Folin, who was a Norwegian who described the biochemistry of PKU back in 1934, what he found was that increased urinary excretion of phenylpyruvic acid, or the phenylpyruvic acid in urine would turn green if you, in the presence of ferric chloride. So, this is maybe one of the more original tests for PKU. The problem with this test was that it lacked sensitivity. The excretion of phenylpyruvic acid in urine in kids, even with PKU, was not high enough within the first few days of life to where you get a positive test. And so, this test was really reserved for just those individuals that had a sibling with PKU. And then roughly 20 years later, Centrowell, who was a physician working in LA, developed what he referred to as the wet diaper test. He obviously didn't have a really good marketing department, because this is a really bad name for a test. It's probably the original point of care test. And it was an improvement over the test developed by Folin, because the fact was that since you were testing the diaper, the phenylpyruvic acid would tend to concentrate a little bit higher. So this test actually had a little bit higher specificity, or sensitivity, compared to the procedure, just testing plain urine. However, like I said, this was really short-lived, and it was 2 years later that Guthrie was really asked to develop or come up with a blood test for PKU. Guthrie originally was a cancer researcher up in Buffalo, and it took him basically 2 years. Originally, he developed a test for blood for PKU, and during this time, he also came up with the idea, which was really novel, of basically doing blood spots on cards, since he was testing neonates and blood sample considerations were a real issue. So by 1961, this was ready for implementation. And actually in 1962, there was a large national trial funded by the U.S. Children's Bureau for Prevention of Mental Retardation. And one of the great impetus for doing this study was the fact that John F. Kennedy, who had a sister that was mentally retarded, was a real proponent of pushing this study forward. And then by 1965, Guthrie's test basically for PKU, as well as a variety, 5 or 6 other analytes, became pretty standard for testing. And in 1965, New York State actually became the first state to mandate dried blood spot testing for these various inborn errors. It's also interesting that New York State is the only state that prohibits direct-to-consumer dried blood spot testing. So maybe a bit of a mixed message there, I don't know. And then, for the next 30 years, the number of analytes that were tested using dried blood spots gradually grew. But it was really in the early 1990s with the work of Millington and using tandem mass spec where, people really foresaw the utility of dried blood spots, because with tandem mass spec, the number of analytes that could be tested was significantly increased. And, I think that's why today, if you look at the things that we can do with dried blood spots, it includes things like therapeutic drug monitoring, wellness testing, HIV antiretroviral monitoring, et cetera. And if you look at the list now of analytes that can be measured using DBS, it's huge. I'm not going to go through the whole list, but it includes things like drugs, specific antibodies to various infectious agents, amino acids, enzymes, hormones. The list is, I don't want to say endless, but it's fairly significant. And obviously this list is not comprehensive, because our good friend vitamin D does not show up on the list. And there are several labs that do offer vitamin D testing. So, why do we do blood spots? Well, there's a lot of advantages that are touted for why we would want to test dried blood spots. Number one, the collection is simple. I don't think that's necessarily true, but most people will state that that's one of the reasons for doing dried blood spots. Another reason is that most analytes are presumed to be stable. Again, I have real questions relative to this, and I have some data later on that'll perhaps show what the stability or instability of many of these analytes really is. Transportation is simple, so the logistics of shipping these are obviously a lot easier than shipping tubes of blood. The storage of dried blood spot cards is fairly easy. It's a whole blood matrix. There's less issues concerning safety or handling. And, part of my, some of the work that I've done with dried blood spots, the reason that we're really looking at dried blood spot testing is that we do some work with India as well as Hawaii. And so, it's the logistics of transportation are a little bit easier. And so a lot of the testing can be done in a centralized lab. So now, instead of opening up a lab in India to do testing, you can have everything shipped to you in the US. But what are some disadvantages? I mean, I think some of the advantages that I touted in the previous slide, I think are not necessarily advantages, but some of the major disadvantages is a skin puncture is required. I don't know about you, but I would rather have 2 draws out of each vein in each arm than having a skin puncture. Maybe I'm just wimpy that way, but it's just that anticipation of getting sliced in the finger. I don't know. The volume of sample is really small. So, for analytes that are present in low concentrations that you want to quantitate, dried blood spot testing may not be applicable. And associated with this, when you elute your analyte of interest from a dried blood spot card, you can have a substantial dilution capacity there. And so again, you have to have, for many things, a very sensitive technique. And then, dried blood spots for many of the methods is really no confirmatory method for what you determine from a dried blood spot card. As far as, skin puncture, as I said, I think, from my experience, I think this is the one critical step that if you don't get this part right, the rest of the testing is really immaterial, because without a good specimen, what you get downstream does not make a difference. We do a lot of work with self-referral or direct-to-consumer blood spot testing. And when you have a nurse or somebody collect a dry blood spot, they're very cognizant of where the sample should be collected. If you give a layperson a dried blood spot kit and say, here, do a finger stick, they're not going to collect the sample from the medial aspect of the finger. Typically what they're going to go for is that center part right there, which is not what you really want to get. So there's a lot of specimen collection considerations when you do direct-to-consumer testing. Number one, the filter paper should not be touched. I can tell you right now, you give somebody a filter paper who's never seen one, the first thing they're going to do is analyze the crap out of it and turn it around in their fingers and touch it every conceivable place on the filter paper. Puncture sites should be, cleansed with 70% isopropanol, and you can give somebody 70% isopropanol to clean. And I can tell you from doing lipid testing, there's a lot of lipids in lanolin soaps and hand creams, and it's not uncommon to get triglycerides of 400 and 500 just due to contamination with hand cream because somebody hasn't cleansed appropriately. Ideally, we recommend the use of a contact-activated lancet. It's just a lot easier than using, disposable single-use or the poke. The first drop of blood should be wiped away. That's not always something that's done. So there's a lot of specimen collection considerations that need to be considered. And then, the last part, the specimens need to be dried appropriately. Typically what's recommended is 3 to 4 hours, but if you're in a high humidity environment, 3 to 4 hours may not still be sufficient to dry a dried blood spot. In our practice, what we always use are contact-activated lancets. We feel that this is probably the most appropriate for direct-to-consumer use. The problem here is that they only got one shot unless you give them 20 activated lancets. So once it's activated, that's it. You don't get a second chance. And again, with the nice part about the contact-activated lancets is that the way the finger is placed with the lancet is that the appropriate section of the finger is actually poked for testing. So assuming that we can get the appropriate sample, the next piece is putting this thing on a dried blood spot card. The most common is Whatman 903 paper. It's interesting, Whatman, which used to be located in beautiful Clifton, New Jersey, and has since moved somewhere else in New Jersey, has been, as a company, has been around for over 260 years. And really where they made their mark was the production of paper for painters for watercolor. So Whatman as a company always was known for producing very high quality paper. And from a filter paper perspective, this tradition has continued. Whatman's now owned by GE, so they're no longer standalone. But the filter paper that we use it's really cotton linen. There should be no additives, at least in the 903 paper. There's no additives and there's no impurities. Whatman 903 filter paper is classified as a Class 2 medical device, so it's a little more sophisticated than, let's say, latex exam gloves, which are a Class 1 medical device, but they're not as sophisticated as, let's say, a test for HIV, which would be Class 3. But given that it is a Class 2 medical device, there's certain post-production parameters that need to be monitored with filter paper. So for newborn screening, each lot of filter paper that's produced by Whatman is tested at the newborn screening QA program at the CDC. And the way this is done is that washed red blood cells are mixed with plasma containing radiolabeled T4. This blood is at a hematocrit of 55%, and then this is spotted into different lots of filter paper. And the parameters that need to be maintained are the following, is that You know, when 100 microliters of blood that's 55, has a hematocrit of 55, when it's spotted onto filter paper, the blood spot diameter should fall within a range of 15 to 17 millimeters. The blood absorption time should take anywhere between 5 and 30 seconds. And the amount of serum uptake per intact red cells, assuming you use a 1/8 or a 3.2 millimeter punch, should be roughly between 1.4 and 1.7 mils of serum. So, you know, and this is, if you just look at just the serum range, you know, the difference between 1.37 and 1.71, you know, when you're trying to quantitate something, you know, you have roughly, you know, a 15 to 20% error already built in just on the basis of the fact that the serum uptake can vary between different lot numbers. These are just some pictures from CDC showing the production of blood that's adjusted to a hematocrit of 55%, and as I mentioned, radiolabeled thyroxine is added back to this, and then this is spotted onto dried DBS cards for, you know, testing purposes, for QA purposes, and then these blood cards are dried. Anybody that does dried blood spot testing, I mean, the first thing you quickly realize is that there's never enough bench space for drying DBS cards. I mean, that's the first thing you really run out of. It's true, DBS cards, once you stack them, they can be put in a very small place, or they can be stored in a small space. But you know, when you have to dry all these cards, they take up a substantial amount of space. You know, CDC's way of getting around this is that they just, you know, put risers between each of the different racks and just do them, you know, horizontally. So this is the way CDC dries blood spot cards. We suspect this is the way our blood cards come from India. This is the way they dry them. You know, so obviously this is not the ideal drying way. You know, exposure to light, high humidity is not the ideal way to dry your dried blood spot cards. And then from CDC, these cards are packaged for QA purposes. There's always a desiccant and a humidity indicator card added. These cards generally don't turn positive until the humidity it goes greater than 30%. So typically maintaining these less than 30% is the ideal storage conditions. In addition to the Whatman 903 paper, there's also paper that's produced by Whatman for nucleic acid testing and certain other parameters, and this is the FTA or FTA elute papers. And both of these papers contain the secret sauce from Whatman that essentially lyses cells, it denatures proteins, and essentially just keeps any bacterial growth from happening on the paper that might decrease the metabolite or analyte that you're looking for. Okay, anybody that's done DBS testing realizes that, you know, obviously when you get this type of card, I mean, that's pretty much a no-brainer. Or maybe this one up here, but you know, the reality is, you know, what you get really runs the gamut of all types of cards. And you know, these are cards that are essentially collected by nursing staff in New York State. You know, when you ask an individual or a layperson to collect their own sample, it's amazing what you'll get back. So, quick quiz for those that have done DBS testing. If you were to receive a card like this, would you take this? I mean, would this be something that you would go punch and use, or is this something that you know, you would pass on? So the key here is that you have areas of light and dark within the card. Also, the card looks like it's been painted or colored. And you know, what we find is that, especially individuals that will spot cards with capillary tubes, they'll use that capillary tube to essentially make sure that the card is completely filled, so it's sort of like painting within the circles, which is a no-no. So this would be something that you would reject. Something like this that you would get, I mean, it's obvious it's not painted. The color is pretty homogeneous throughout the circle. So this is something that we would probably take. So this would be an example of a properly collected specimen. Something like this is more obvious too. This is typically when you have clotted blood that's applied to the card. So, one of the keys are, there's many ways of punching these cards out nowadays, and many of the systems to punch DBS cards are automated. But what the automated systems really look at is just the red circle. They really don't necessarily detect the fact that you might have clots on the card. So, you still have, there's a significant manual aspect to DBS testing where, you have to have somebody with the eyes to be able to reject or accept something if it's appropriate or not. So that was just an example of blood clots. And blood clots are most commonly caused by touching the same circle to the blood several different times, or filling the circle on both sides of the card. And then again, we've already seen an example of a card that would pass and be something that we would want to test. Obviously with this, this sort of looks strange here. That doesn't look like something normally that you should get. So this would be another reject card. And this is an example of contamination. Contamination happens a lot more frequently than we would like to see. Typically, if somebody does a finger stick and they start squeezing the area around the site to milk the blood, that's, to get better blood flow, that can give you contamination. Allowing the filter paper to come into contact with a gloved hand or a hand that contains lotion or powder, that can give you the same sort of thing. And also, if blood spots are exposed to direct heat, you can sort of get this bleeding and contamination. And I believe this is the last one. Obviously, this doesn't look too good. And this would be an example of serum rings. And this is where the blood is clotted before application, and it gives you serum rings. And again, this could be due to a number of different factors: not wiping alcohol from the puncture site, allowing the filter paper to come into contact with hand lotion or alcohol, squeezing, again, milking the finger to get more blood, improper drying, or applying blood to with a paper with a capillary tube. And this would just be an example of apply so much blood that you just get folds and creases through the DBS card. So, as I said, collection, and it's really, for DBS testing, it's really no different than what we see in the lab with respect to specimen. Specimen integrity is really everything. It's sort of garbage in, garbage out. If you don't get the correct specimen, you're not going to get the correct answer. And even once you collect the specimen, there's then a number of downstream variables that can affect measurements that are collected on filter paper. And these include things such as post-collection handling and storage of the paper, humidity considerations, hematocrit of the blood donor, the absorption time for blood that when it comes into contact with the paper, and then the drying time of blood on the paper. So, when we're dealing with liquid specimens in the lab, if we have two different tubes, a 10 microliter aliquot from a tube that's half full is going to be the same as a 10 microliter aliquot from a tube that's a quarter full. However, if we apply 75 microliters of blood to one DBS card, and this card only gets, let's say, 40 microliters of blood, and we take a 1/8 inch punch from that, even though both of these punches are from the blood spot, the amount of sample that we're going to extract from those two cards can be very different. So, that's why it's always important that the whole card be completely full, because if you don't have complete absorption and spread of the blood sample, you're going to get a little more blood. It's going to be a little more concentrated in that small spot versus what you're going to get in a larger spot. And this is really, sort of a study which looked at samples which had a 55% hematocrit, but where different volumes of blood were spotted onto the card. And you can see that when you spotted very low amounts of sample, the amount of serum that's extracted from that particular spot is much lower than when you put a lot more blood on that card. So the less amount of blood, or the smaller the spot, the less serum that's extracted. So, you can see that it basically ranges from roughly 5.3 to, 6, which is a significant percent difference, which makes a big difference when you're trying to quantitate something that, where a 10% or 20% difference in quantitation is a big difference. So that's the effect of spot volume. Same thing when you look at hematocrit effect. Low hematocrits are generally, or hematocrits roughly between 30 and 50, roughly give you, on a 6 millimeter punch, give you approximately between 6 and 6.5 microliters of serum. However, once you get above a hematocrit of 50, the amount of serum that gets extracted from that spot goes down. I mean, it's just the fact that you have more blood cells. But again, hematocrit plays a big part in this. So, the effect of hematocrit and the effect of blood spot are two things that you can't control hematocrit. You can control the size of the blood spot by making sure that you're only using blood that's from a DBS card where the entire circle is filled. And then, within analytes themselves, there's a number of variables that affect the stability of the analyte, and these include time, temperature, humidity, as well as light for those analytes that are light sensitive. This was a study that came out in Clin Biochem last year, and I believe these guys, they looked at maybe 40 different parameters. And, they stored cards at 37 degrees, which most people aren't going to store at 37 degrees. But I think what they were really trying to do is say, okay, if we're in a third world country and we don't have refrigeration and we're collecting DBS cards for analysis, what's going to happen when we store these cards at 37 degrees? And what they did is they stored cards at both low and high humidity. So the closed circles are cards that were stored at low humidity, and where the elution was performed. When they tried to elute the analyte, they performed it at the standard elution time. The open circles or open squares represent elution, this would be low humidity with an extended elution time. And then the squares are cards that were stored at high humidity. And it's no surprise that when you look at the enzymes, biotinidase and this one here, that both low and high humidity, the enzymes fall off fairly quickly. The more stable analytes like succinylacetone and arginine, both low humidity tend to help maintain or preserve the analyte over the 30-day period that the study was conducted, whereas high humidity essentially killed off the analyte. And this is just an example of 4 analytes, but when you looked at the 30 or 40 different things that they looked at, it's very clear that the storage at 37 degrees and high humidity is not the way you want to go. So their conclusions were that elevated, which conclusions aren't that all that unexpected, is that elevated temperature and humidity accelerated the degradation process, especially more so in enzymes and other analytes. Extending the elution time, or the time that you're trying to elute your analyte of interest from the DBS card, usually increased recovery of the analytes that were stored at high humidity, but usually it was less than 10%. They didn't show graphs for T4 and TSH, but these are 2 analytes that a lot of people are now offering from a wellness testing perspective. And what they found is that the degradation of T4 was 10 times higher at high humidity compared to low humidity over the 30-day period. T4, they saw an 86% loss in T4 at high humidity compared with the 19% loss at low humidity. And then TSH also degraded, although the loss was only 3 times higher at high humidity compared to low humidity. So clearly, nobody's going to store cards in these conditions, or they shouldn't store cards in these conditions. But, even storage at a very short period of time at 37 degrees, within 2, 3, 4, 7 days, many analytes are degraded to where measuring them doesn't really make any sense. These slides are, I apologize for these. I'll go through each one of these. This is work that we did at one of the labs that I'm working at, where we were looking at stability of A1C. And what we did, we had 11 different individuals that were collected, which had A1C values ranging from 5 to 11%. And then we stored the cards at different conditions. These were this graph here shows cards that were stored at room temperature without any desiccant. The graph down here shows cards that were stored at room temperature, but they were sealed with a desiccant. These were cards that were sealed with a desiccant and refrigerated, and then these were cards that were sealed with desiccant and frozen. Okay, and it's very obvious that at room temperature, even with a desiccant, A1C shows a substantial increase over time. The average increase being a 1% increase in A1C in the group over time. So if the average A1C of these 11 individuals was 7, by 30 days, it would have been 8. So again, it's a substantial increase. Even at refrigerated temperatures, there was up to a 0.5% increase over time. So these would be cards that are refrigerated with a desiccant. Storage conditions, which when you read many of the papers that are published, state that, A1C is stable under these conditions. Our work suggests that this is really not the case, that even at refrigerated temperatures, A1C is not stable. And it looks like at frozen temperatures, A1C is the only way that you can really maintain stability. One of the other findings that we found is that looking at each of these individual samples, it appeared that the increase in A1C over time appears to be also related to the baseline glucose in the sample. So that if you have two samples, both of which have a baseline A1C of, let's say, 7%, if one of those samples had a glucose of 100 and the other one had a glucose of 250, the one that had the glucose of 250 showed a much greater increase over time compared to the one that had the lower glucose. So, I think there's other than temperature and humidity, I think there's other variables within the sample itself which also impact the stability of A1C. Okay, so wellness testing using dried blood spot technology. 4 analytes that we have looked at to date that we're trying to essentially define the parameters or invalidate the testing for: total cholesterol, HDL cholesterol, triglycerides, and hemoglobin A1C. For A1C, assuming that the samples are stored appropriately, i.e. frozen and with desiccant, you can see that basically from, when you compare whole blood A1C to A1C measured from a dried blood spot card, the correlation is actually very good. I mean, A1C out of those 4 analytes I just mentioned is probably the most robust of the methods. And it's because you're really looking at a ratio of total hemoglobin to glycosylated hemoglobin. And this is just a Bland-Altman plot showing the difference. And this is work that was done March of last year. We're still doing some tweaks to the assay just to try to tighten this up a little bit. But for all intents and purposes, measuring A1C off a dried blood spot card is definitely feasible and something that's easily, or good accuracy is easily achievable. Cholesterol and the other lipids are a little more problematic. This shows cholesterol, again, serum cholesterol versus cholesterol measured off a dried blood spot card, and the percent difference as a Bland-Altman plot. You know, not as tight as you'd want to see. I mean, obviously this wouldn't pass NCEP criteria for doing cholesterol, but you know, as a screening tool, it's probably not bad. Again, I think it's, you know, something that, you know, we're still working on, and it's really probably not ready for prime time. HDL is probably the worst out of all the analytes. One of the problems is that you get very low signal, HDL being much lower, obviously, typically much lower than total cholesterol, so you're working with a much lower signal and a lot more variability in the measurements. And you know, the reportable range that we're, you know, trying to achieve is between 20 and 90. What we might do is just offer it as a screen, so you know, instead of having definitive quantitative values, report cholesterol as being either greater than or less than some cutoff threshold. And then of the three lipids, triglycerides, HDL, and total cholesterol, triglycerides are probably the cleanest. This graph just shows this would be the signal that you get from the actual DBS measurement. And then when you take the dilution factor into account, this is the correlation that you would get between serum and dried blood spot testing. So, you know, again, with triglycerides, because you have that dilutional effect, you do have less of a signal that you get, but it's still, I mean, quantitatively, it's not too bad. Some other applications, in addition to wellness testing, a lot in the literature now relates to HIV testing or antiretroviral monitoring for individuals that are HIV positive, either used by quantitation of HIV viral load, as well as identification of HIV infected infants. There's a variety of antibodies, and Sean could probably speak better to this than I can. For detection of viruses and DBS-LU, it's HTLV1, hepatitis A, B, and C, malaria, measles, mumps, rubella, dengue. So there's a lot of work now relative to use of DBS for these other considerations. And then as well as detection of viral nucleic acid on DBS. And again, there's a variety of applications, including HIV-1 subtypes, CMV, hepatitis, HTLV-1. As far as new technology for dry blood spot testing, I think, you know, what's really come out in the last 3 or 4 or 5 years really relate back to the problems that people have with getting the appropriate DBS sample. Probably the newest thing that's come out is collection systems for DBS. This is one which is actually pretty slick. After you do a finger stick, the blood is introduced on top into this collection device here. It diffuses into this star-shaped collection wick. There's also a desiccant within the device, which then helps dry the DBS card and keep it desiccated. And then this whole thing is closed, and this is what gets mailed in. So it's, you know, so what you really have now is a one-piece unit that allows the sample to be desiccated. And then instead of punching these, essentially each of these individual pieces of the star are broken off, and then this is what's used for testing. So again, you know, people, I think, you know, recognizing the collection issues and the some of the problems with you know, the types of samples that you do get, you know, the real impetus, I think, or the real focus is going to be on coming up of ways of, you know, collecting the sample, desiccating it, and mailing it to where it needs to go while maintaining sample integrity. And then finally, you know, there's a variety of use of other matrices. You know, people often refer to these as dried matrix spots, but, you know, testing instead of using dried whole blood collection of plasma or using plasma for analysis and avoiding the whole problem with hemoglobin interference in the assay is, one avenue that some people have taken. Other people have described, and actually this is something that the one lab I'm involved is saliva testing for antibodies. So using dried saliva or dried saliva cards for testing. And other people have even looked at tears, synovial fluid, or urine, again, for the same sort of thing. So, this is, dried testing on blood cards is not really, is not necessarily just for blood, but there's a variety of other matrices which could be tested, which may have applications. I can tell you from experience, one of the problems with plasma is that when you're punching out a dried blood card, the fact that it's red makes it very easy to see what you're punching. Plasma or saliva, which tend to be clear, presents some other problems, which are fairly obvious. And with that, I'd be happy to take any questions.
I just want to ask you to repeat my question back for the audience and anybody else's question too, since they don't hear me too well. Are there analytes where binding to the cellulose causes a problem?
The question is are there any analytes where binding of the cellulose is a problem? That's a good question. I guess, one of the things that we'll look at when we're looking to elute, we'll look at different, so for lipids, for example, what we elute with, and I know some people use Triton, we use methanol at various concentrations, which for certain, if you're doing a chemical assay, can be helpful because if you're eluting with an alcohol-based, you don't get the hemoglobin, so you have it's a cleaner specimen, you don't have the interference effect. You do what you can.
In the quest to make things more quantitative, but not knowing the actual denominator, not knowing the volume precisely that you put on there, one could think of things that you could perhaps normalize to, things like creatinine or there's other things that vary. Are there things that you're using now that you've looked at? Is there a favorite normalization factor in the blood spot community to get good quantitative?
So the question is there other analytes that you could measure off the card that you could use to normalize for the other analyte of interest? Actually, one of the things we actually looked at was electrolytes. So there was a paper published 3 or 4 years ago where somebody actually, what they did is they measured the whole blood concentration of sodium and potassium, and then used that as a way for normalizing what they were measuring. Obviously, it's 2 additional analyses that you need to do. We haven't looked at doing that, but that's, when we've looked at various options for normalization. Some people look at albumin, but again, you're assuming that everybody's got an albumin of 3.8 or 4. So it's not it may help in some circumstances. In other circumstances, it may be actually somewhat misleading.
So these new papers with what you call the secret sauce, are they better like for most analytes, or are there just certain classes of analytes that they're better?
So the question is, are the newer papers that have additives, are they better for certain analytes? We haven't used them. My understanding is that they're geared more for nucleic acid testing, as well as certain enzymes that may be deactivated or less stable. Obviously you're not using those, or?
Well, I know about the nucleic acids, but I just, was wondering if they make everything better.
We haven't looked at testing for enzymes, so the analytes that we're looking at we're assuming are fairly stable if they're stored appropriately. But I think you're right. I think there's probably a lot of enzymes that would not be stable under certain conditions.
Related to that, have you looked at the temperature and the humidity effects on the cholesterols and triglycerides?
So the question is, have we looked at the effects of temperature and humidity on cholesterol and triglycerides? The answer is no. I mean, for those things, I mean, when we've done our testing, you know, after we make the DBS card, we're storing them frozen with a desiccant. But I mean, for full validation, we would go back and do that because I mean, you know, if we're looking at doing wellness testing, you know, we realize that, you know, we need to know exactly what the actual storage conditions, you know, what we can get away with and what they actually need to be.
So Steve, is there going to be, the temperature effects look pretty strong. So does that mean you can't test wellness lipids from people in Georgia in the summer? I'm thinking about mailboxes and things like that.
So the question is, you know, with the temperature effects, you know, if you offer direct to consumer, is temperature going to be an issue? I think the answer is yes. Yeah.
Yes. One of the challenges for the field of DBS is what to do about proficiency testing. And yet at the same time, the CDC and the state neonatal testing labs have experience with it. Do you have information about what they find when they're trying to do quantitative assessment across the states for neonatal testing, and what kind of CVs and precision they get?
The question is with regard to proficiency testing, and especially in the realm of neonatal testing, I guess what the experience is there. That I'm not, I mean, you know, I've been to our state lab several times. I mean, I really don't have a good feel for, you know, when they do their PT or when they get samples from CDC, what, you know, what the variability is that you know, what's considered to be acceptable, I guess. You know, within the wellness testing sphere, or, you know, testing for these other analytes, obviously there is no PT. I think there's going to be a need to do that or do something for PT.
So I know the paper is really standardized, but as far as I can tell from your slides and what I've seen, the format is not standardized at all. Like the state lab papers and the papers we have and the papers I've seen elsewhere are just cut and shaped and organized differently. Why hasn't that been standardized?
So the question is that, you know, why isn't the paper that's offered by different different commercial firms standardized? Are you referring to just what the number of spots, the size of the spot, or?
Sort of in general, yeah. I mean, we talk about processing, right? First, you got to get the blood, then you got to process it right all before you get to the test. And with all these different formats coming in the door, you know,
Yeah, you know, I mean, that's been one question I've had, is that, you know, if you're doing newborn screen testing and you get your paper, you know, I think that's obviously got to meet certain criteria or certain standards. Some of the Wattman paper, I mean, I guess if it's considered Wattman 903, again, it's considered a class 2. So, you know, my assumption at least is that paper has to meet the same post-production parameters as what's used in the newborn screening programs. If it's some other form of Wattman, then no, it probably has different parameters or different criteria.
Have you ever compared finger stick blood spots to blood spots that have been made from EDTA anticoagulated or other anticoagulated whole blood from the same person? And is there ever a systematic proportional bias, or is it just different variability?
I think I was talking about this with somebody. The question is there a difference in finger stick versus a peripheral blood collected from a peripheral stick?
But then spotted onto a piece of
Oh,
I think a lot of people use spotted
yeah.
whole blood. Compare that to the other assays.
We actually just started a study 2 weeks ago where we got volunteers, and it was a finger stick and then a venous draw, and then the finger stick was used to spot blood cards, and then the samples that were collected in EDTA or heparin, we collected in both EDTA and heparin, were also spotted. So the idea is to, have a blood spot card that's just finger stick, and then one that's been respotted from heparin and one that's spotted from EDTA. Previously, we had done a finger stick study where we compared finger stick versus peripheral draw, and what we found is that from a physiologic standpoint, triglycerides in a finger stick can be 20 to 30 milligrams lower than what you get peripherally, and then glucose can be anywhere from 10 to 15 milligrams lower on a finger stick versus from a peripheral draw, and that's, it's just physiologic. And then actually, I was working with a company that they were trying to get FDA waiver, CLIA waiver for doing finger stick triglycerides, and the FDA told them that, well, as your predicate, you need to do compare it to a peripheral draw measured on this analyzer, and then compare it to a finger stick. Well, they didn't pass the FDA, they didn't get CLIA waiver because there's a physiologic difference. And when they went back and tried to argue, well, the correlation looked good, it was just that physiologically, you get lower values on a finger stick. So.
Again, I think, thank you for sharing your information and so on and perspectives. It sounds like you have substantial reservations about whether this is ready for prime time for wellness testing at this point in time.
The question is, do I have reservations about this for wellness testing? Yes, I do. I think, and it's not that, it's the reservations I think can be overcome, but I think, I think there's got to be processes in place. There's going to be certain analytes that you can't do via finger stick for wellness testing because they're either unstable or we're going to have to find a workaround for maintaining the stability once those samples are collected.
And the other side of my question is, do you think they're good enough for epidemiologic testing for populations rather than for individuals?
The question is whether or not DBS would be applicable to epidemiologic testing. I think for certain things, if you're looking at the incidence of specific antibodies or things that are relatively stable, I'd say yes, that definitely there's there's a good utility there. For things that are unstable or we don't know what, if we can use blood cards that have been frozen away for the last 20 years, I think those studies need to be done.
The new star-shaped cards that you mentioned, they must dry more rapidly than having to than the open drying of several hours. So that must be a significant benefit for POCT type applications. Is that something that is looked at, or?
The question is the star-shaped card that I've shown, is the drying faster or is it more applicable to POCT? That's what they're claiming. I really haven't seen any literature where people have done studies using that to demonstrate that these are, an advancement over what you can get off a regular Whatman 903. So, conceptually it looks really good. It's slick, but whether or not it helps in any way is, I think, really remains to be seen.
So they're not Whatman 903 papers? They're not derived from those papers?
I don't believe it's not Whatman 903, and I'm not even sure if it's FDA cleared or FDA approved. That's the other issue. Thank you.